Thank you very much all for joining today. For today's Oasys MassMotion 2023 Features and Case Studies webinar. My name is John Hayes. I'm the Business Development Manager here at Oasys, the software house of structural engineering firm Arup. MassMotion is our pedestrian simulation software and is one of a number of tools that we have on offer and will be our topic of conversation for today. Please feel free to add any questions into the chat and we'll take a look at these during our Q&A session. But right now, let's hand over the reins to Lachlan Miles, who is our MassMotion product lead. So Lachlan, over to you.
Thanks, John. And most importantly, thanks everyone for joining. Have a hopefully a really engaging conversation to come over the next sort of 30 to 45 minutes. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to say a couple things about MassMotion because we've got a few folks who have joined the webinar who know a lot about this, and we have a few folks who are relatively new to the world of pedestrian simulation, human movement simulation. I'm not going to speak for too long though, because we have we're very, very fortunate to have a number of different panelists who are going to talk about their experiences in the industry in which these tools are used. And so we're going to have a bit of a roundtable conversation about a number of different things, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that people in the chat have as possible. So without further ado, let me just dive right in. So speaking on behalf of the product team, just want to give a brief overview of MassMotion and then what's new and then what we have coming up. So a little bit of a brief recap and then a little bit of looking forward. So what is MassMotion? Some of you know this very well, and some of you know it a little bit less well. And so it is a pedestrian simulation tool that looks at the movement of people through a space. It is a design and operational tool, and the aim is to test various different scenarios. Born as a design tool, primarily looking at capacity and looking at how people move through space, initially looking at how we right-size things like large infrastructure projects. It has since moved on to be a lot more flexible than that, and so it gets used a lot in the fire engineering and emergency egress world, gets used in the user experience and sort of user design world, and gets used in a number of different market sectors around the world. And so we're very lucky to have a couple of people with quite broad experience in multiple different parts of the world speaking over the next little while. And so really, it's a tool that allows people to test the elements of their design from a human perspective. And so really what that's looking at is, where are your congestion hotspots? How long does it take to evacuate? What's going on in terms of overall human experience? And so a number of different ways in which we can test different design or operational scenarios, and a number of different analytics that you can extract from these models. So not just communicating it through to stakeholders, but also extracting hard numbers around the way that people move. So just really quickly, some of you may have seen this before, but this is a quick, very, very whistle-stop tour of some of the types of projects that MassMotion can be used on, moving from public realm through to sports and rail, which are sort of large, major crowd events, through to things where you might not necessarily have tens or hundreds of thousands of people moving around, but things in the dozen space. Gets used a lot to plan commercial buildings and things like that. And so overall, it's quite a flexible tool, but just wanted to kind of to ground that. And so for some of you who've used MassMotion in the last little while, there's been a couple of changes and we've expanded the team fairly significantly. And so one of the things that we've really been focusing on over the last 12 to 18 months is really trying to fit within the broader workflows that people find themselves in within this industry. And so we'll be looking at how to do things faster and how to do things with a minimum of fast and a limit of a manual re-entry. And so we have within MassMotion our software development kit. We've made that a bit easier to use by bringing a Python script object directly inside MassMotion itself, and trying to make that easier and easier over time. So the latest version of MassMotion, which was released earlier this year, has a number of different upgrades to try and make that a little bit more user-friendly and intuitive and easy to use, to do things like automate the production of results or the changes to geometry or even changes to agent behavior, but also things like being able to run quite complex scenarios. And so integrating it into larger workflows where we're starting to talk into testing hundreds or thousands of designs in an automated way. We've also made a number of different changes to how people do complex operations. And so I know that there are some people who use MassMotion in a variety of different formats, and that could be in the themed entertainment world, it could be in public realm, it could be in sort of major arts and culture pursuits. Sometimes the way people move in those spaces is quite complex, and you have people doing series of quite interesting conditional behavior. And so that might be holding off in one area depending on what's going on in terms of populations in certain areas of a model and certain areas of a space. We've had a flexible system to do that for some time, but it's been overhauled to make it a bit easier to do some of the major use cases. We have also taken a quick look at how people interact with complex models, and so things like cross sections and things along those lines. And so there's a number of different things that we've put in there, including the section tool. I'm going to talk about what's coming up, but one thing that we've been working on for a while is trying to make the software faster to run and faster to overall complete a simulation. And so we've made a number of different improvements to our geometry and simulation systems. And that is both in terms of agent movement and agent speed, so making the actual simulations faster, but also moving around how some of the geometry works. And so that dovetails nicely with where we're taking the software over the next little while. And I think it's fair to say for everyone on this call that this industry is moving quite rapidly, and that could be on the research side of things, or it could be on the technology side of things. And I think we're going to hear a number of examples of how people are integrating new technologies or working with different systems or working in terms of overall new different types of data and things like that. And so we want to make sure that MassMotion is able to interact with that at a fundamental level. And so we're basically taking the overall MassMotion engine out. We've done a lot of work so far on this, and that's led to some of the performance improvements in the latest version, but trying to make that overall more responsive to current research and more responsive to new ways of working, things like cloud running and things like that. So overall, trying to make it a more flexible tool that more tightly integrates with other people's workflows, a substantially faster tool, and one that reflects the diversity of its populations of users and spaces more effectively and more readily. And so that's quite vague, but there's a number of different things that we're working on, but it is grounded in a combination of some of our key technical drivers, so major changes to computing power, and also some of the research drivers into different ways that people move. And that could be in an emergency egress context, which is an extremely diverse and fast moving research field, or in the sort of transport and human movement space. And I'm extremely pleased to note that we are continuing to grow the team. Historically, it's been quite a modest development team, but it's expanded in size over the last couple of years to make sure that we're producing more and more, and we're speeding up our rate of development. We're also investing directly in research, and so bringing in people to connect more closely with academic users. And so for anyone who's watching this is from the academic side of the world, to be more closely linked and more supportive. And so that's something that we're extremely proud of, and will, I think, only move from strength to strength into the future. And so that's a very brief, here's what's going on over the next kind of 12 to 18 months with MassMotion, but I don't want to talk for too long. I'm happy to take any questions on the future of the product, or on some of the use cases, or how it can be used, or what it can be used for right now. But I think it's probably most appropriate if we move on and start introducing our lovely panelists to talk, to really hear not just from me, but also from people who actually use these and other tools in the industry and see how things actually work. So I'm going to pass over to our panelists. So Sarah, I'll start with you. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name's Sarah Caldwell. I've worked for Arup for 16 years with a specialism in people movement and pedestrian planning. So I've worked on many projects, including stations and stadia, using software, including MassMotion on those projects. And I'll hand over to Lucy.
Yep. Hi, everyone. So my name's Lucy Evers, and I also work in Arup, but I'm part of the UK fire team. So I've only been a fire engineer for about 2.5 years now, but in that time I have gained a fair amount of experience using MassMotion over a wide range of projects. So I'll kind of bring the perspective to this discussion as a MassMotion user. But yeah, I'll pass you over to Michael.
Hey everyone, so my name is Michael Kinsey. I work for a company called Movement Strategies, and previously I was a fire engineer at Arup, mainly involved in a lot of evacuation modelling, but now I'm more involved in a broader context of people movement, and really my role is paid to be curious about how people behave and how they move within the environment to help improve things. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, thank you all very much again for coming and being part of this. Michael, let's start with you. And I think because especially because your new role is so interesting, looking at all of the different factors, how do you start considering those various different things? It's such a broad topic. Where do you start when you're looking at like how do people move through a space or evacuate a space in terms of key factors?
Wow, it's a massive question. I think the interesting thing I found is because I come from how people behave in emergency fire evacuations to now more broadly, including fire evacuation, also security and also circulation situations. It gets a lot more complicated, I would say, certainly when we jump from fire evacuations, because evacuation, there's certain assumptions you make about homogenous behaviour, people all doing fairly similar things, whereas in general circulation, it's far more broad. And I think in terms of where we start with modelling, I think you have to start with understanding the subject matter before you start touching models, because that's a core component of any model. It's you understand, what the key things people do, because when the model does something unexpected or not how it should be, you need to be able to notice that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think it's about sort of starting from the start and not just jumping in and doing the modeling is really important. And I think that is a good way to ground this conversation, despite the fact that we are talking about modeling software. Sarah, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because you've worked in kind of looking at human movement all around the world, really.
Yeah, so I've used models a lot, and in terms of like getting data into the models, so it can be very straightforward. So we make direct use of 3D models that are produced by structural or mechanical engineers. We remove the information that we don't need, such as walls and ceilings, and then we can automatically import them into MassMotion. MassMotion also auto-assigns objects as it recognises flaws and barriers, so this can really speed up the process of setting up a model. We've also used reality capture to scan and model the inside of existing buildings using LiDAR or Matterport scanners. This is really invaluable for historical existing buildings where plans don't exist, are inaccurate or are incomplete. A LiDAR technology enables the generation of highly accurate within 3mm 3-point cloud models that represent the shape and features of the building or structural elements. And LiDAR scanning can capture the height of buildings, which is useful if the project involves a mezzanine or other proposals to expand the facilities upwards. The scanned images can be then adjusted within software such as MicroStation and imported straight into MassMotion. And this is much faster than when compared to manual techniques such as lasers.
Yeah, cool. And I think that's fascinating. And it's interesting to see how quickly that's changed, over the years, because that was always a bit of a, like, getting the right kinds of data was always a bit of a blocker for this kind of work in various different contexts. So I think that's really interesting. So Lucy, what do you have any thoughts about that, especially someone who's kind of closer to the start of your career in terms of working with like how to set up these questions and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously coming in at it from quite a new perspective. I think that the way in which we do build our models is very important in like we want to be doing that as quickly and as automatically as possible, so we can actually focus and spend more time on the things that Michael was talking about, like understanding why we're doing the modeling in the first place and what we want to achieve with our models, and you know what we're going to run in terms of scenarios. So in fire engineering, we'll run a series of different fire scenarios to represent kind of challenges to our design. So when we're kind of building up the models, I mean, typically, I understand that we were kind of building these things up manually using like 2D drawing layers and stuff. But now with that automatic feature to be able to take 3D geometry and convert it quite quickly into usable spaces within MassMotion, that's going to free up quite a lot of time for us to be able to then go and plan our analysis in more detail. And it gives us more of that core kind of time that we should be spending as engineers in the modeling process.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Thank you. And I think it's really about and this is a weird thing to say from someone who's looking after a tool, but this is trying to get the tool in the background so that the decision making really comes to the foreground. And Michael, I'm interested in your views on this, because you've worked in various different places in the world looking at various different ways, like primarily evacuation, but also in how people move more generally. These sorts of tools, and not just MassMotion, but these sorts of tools can be used all the time, but don't necessarily get used all the time. Do you think, I guess, what do you think stopping that is probably one question, or like, do you think the fact that we're trying to make this faster will make it be used more often, I guess is the question.
I think it's a great question, and I think there's probably kind of three key barriers, certainly for evacuation modelling, that perhaps we face to using them on projects. The one is just a general lack of education about what you can actually do with a model. There is certainly changing a perspective, but certainly in the past it used to be people thought human behaviour was too complicated to consider, and it's too unpredictable. You also had people saying you can make a model tell you anything, so we shouldn't bother with any modelling. Luckily, you know, those voices are dying out now. I think following on from that, it used to be that you'd only use these projects for evacuation modelling on large, big, heavy fee projects, and perhaps that was in part due to the fact that it took so long to build up these models. But nowadays you can build a model very, very quickly. It's not days, weeks, it can be, you know, hours even. So I think there's certainly a change, and I think we could start be using these models more on much smaller projects. And also, lastly, the third option, certainly for fire in fire evacuation modelling, is you'd only think about perhaps using the models where you're deviating from fire codes, and I need to justify through performance-based design that it still provides a sufficient level of safety. However, I think there's value even in a fire code compliant design to use evacuation modelling to give you insights into how people might behave, where congestion might occur, how can we improve things. I mean, I'd like to see the default being we're going to use an evacuation model, and the exception being why don't we? Because cost is growing, is increasingly not an issue, I would say.
That would be, I think, especially in the evacuation world, a fairly major mindset shift, I think. So it's you know, maybe one day we will get there, but that's interesting. So I think that's interesting. Just speaking on picking up that thread of trying to make things easier, I guess, or faster. Lucy, I know that you've used a number of the sort of the automation tools over the last little while. Would you mind just speaking a little bit about that, just in your own experience, how you found it, and you know, if it's been helpful? That's a bit of a leading question because I hope the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, you'll be happy to know that it is, yes. So recently I was working on quite a large infrastructure project. It was a large rail station, and with the help of the Oasys team, thank you, we developed a script which helped us to run a set number of simulation runs using a random seed each time. But the big thing was that it post-processed all of our results for us at the end. So it extracted things like evacuation times from final exits and from the place of fire origin, which is what we kind of focus on in our analysis quite a lot. And by having the script kind of do this all automatically for us, it saved a lot of time, which allowed us to kind of have quite a rapid feedback loop to the client and to the design team. So it ultimately gives us more time to kind of build upon the design, scrutinize the simulation playback, and kind of identify issues or further analysis that we need to undertake. And typically, like the time periods in which we get to model are always kind of quite similar. They're always quite tight on time. So the more time that we can kind of get to actually make these decisions and look into our kind of simulations in more detail, then all the better. So certainly excited to see where we can kind of take that script tool further. I think building in kind of different, automatically setting up different fire scenarios, like turning exits on and off and stuff, will be something that we're kind of hoping to kind of go down in the near future.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think, Michael, that really ties into your point about spending more time doing the thinking and less time turning the handle on various different scenarios and things like that. Yeah, so I think it's good to know that they're being used, and it is something that we think is important, and we'll try and make easier and easier and kind of more user-friendly over time. Speaking about sort of new technology and things like that, Sarah, a question for you, and it's really in terms of some of the reality capture work that you've been looking at, because it's quite new, and so I guess, how do you, because you're busy, you're busy delivering projects, you've got a lot on, how do you make the time, or how do you like keep abreast of things that are on the cutting edge, in terms of, that could be in terms of different ways that you could bring data in, or different ways that you could use some of the tools that you use?
Yeah, so in terms of the reality capture, we keep up to date with new technology being released by being connected to the manufacturers through forums, newsletters, via LinkedIn. But we have a specialist reality capture team within Arup who work on projects for buildings and bridges projects. So they ensure that they're up to date with the latest technology in terms of reality capture.
Yeah, cool. Because I think that's it's always a thing that as sort of moving from being in the industry to being on the sort of building a product side of things, is always, oh, we've got all this cool stuff, or ways to interact with new types of data and things like that. And it's always like, well, I hope people have the time to use this when they're not too busy delivering for clients and things like that. And Michael, I wonder if you just had any general thoughts on that.
I think the use of technology it's fascinating seeing where it's taking us, I think, with setting up models, making it easy to do things, and certainly with the introduction of BIM, I think there's so much more potential that's going to be not only building models but interpreting model results, and I think it's going to open up new doors for us in the future. And I think the stuff we have with MassMotion with the scripting object just enables that level of flexibility for use. It empowers the users to start doing things on their own as well. And I know certainly for researchers this is a major game changer, because previously, if you wanted to change a model, well, first of all, a lot of research try and develop models from scratch, and they're, over time they'd be put down after the research project. Whereas with a scripting object, it allows you to an accessible way for potentially non-programmers to get access to changing your models, interrogating your models, and especially with the autocomplete function, it saves you umpteen hours having to look through stale documentation about what the function calls are. So
yeah, and I think that's interesting, because it's we've tried to build a quite flexible system, and it's interesting that it will get used in research. This is a bit of a kind of a curly question, but I can imagine that kind of stuff being used on the research side for fire egress, but I imagine it's going to be a bit of a challenge to start doing like custom behavior for clients, given the sensitive nature of things. Is that fair?
I think so. I think it could open up potential for things like a marketplace where people will put their scripts up, and then there's a lot of reusability where someone, oh, I need that, I can take that script and put it in without you necessarily having to reissue an update of your code every time a new function comes in. So I think it opens scalability in a variety of different directions. It might go in directions we don't know. Yeah, and I think that's something that
speaking in terms of the MassMotion product team, we're definitely up for doing. And so I think it's a, rather than sort of too many silos, because I think across the architecture, construction and engineering sector, there's probably a fair few of those, but I won't say too much more on that or I'll get in trouble. So I guess pivoting a little bit and talking about how these tools actually get used, because I know we've got a fairly diverse group of people who are joining in terms of how these tools are used to help people make decisions. And this could be about the operations of a space or about the designs of a space. You probably all have thoughts on this because you've responded directly to clients, because it's not, hey, build me a model. It's, hey, does this work? Or, hey, I have two options, which one is better? Or something like that. Sarah, I'm interested in your views on that. And that's in terms of like, from a decision-making perspective, how do these sorts of tools support that process? Because it's not, we don't live in a vacuum, right?
Sure. Yeah, so MassMotion serves as an excellent collaboration and communication tool for project stakeholders. Its visualizations and simulations provide a common language for architects, engineers, and clients to understand and discuss crowd-related design aspects by demonstrating the impact of different design choices and operational strategies. MassMotion helps align expectations, foster collaboration, and facilitate informed decision making. And we found our clients particularly interested in the outputs like density plots, the videos, so they can sort of fly through a design and really feel how it will operate. And by using those outputs, we can demonstrate to the client where there's areas of design that are possibly overcrowded or underused or experience excessive crossflows. And so we can help to suggest ways that we can optimize the design by potentially making changes to the layout, maybe adding in some more retail in an area that's not used. So we can really work with the client to make sure they get the best out of the design.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because sometimes it's about optimizing a space rather than just, you know, reducing it or looking at things in one aspect. So that's really, really interesting. Lucy, interested in your thoughts about that, about how you use this tool and similar tools, I guess, to communicate on various different things, and how you kind of help make the point from an egress and evacuation perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our work is kind of working through a range of fire scenarios, and actually we use tools to model those fires, and then we compare the results from that with our results from kind of evacuation models like MassMotion. And it's definitely way more valuable kind of running through, even just having the model open or running through videos or images on screen with the clients or stakeholders in engagement meetings, so that we can show kind of where the design maybe needs to be refined in a certain way, or like, yeah, it definitely helps having the image on screen to show, look, you've got a huge queue here and we've got cross flows kind of going all over the place and it's not working. And rather than kind of writing that out in a report with a set of results, it really helps to communicate that issue and help people understand where we're coming from and why we're saying you need to increase the width of your stair by this amount, kind of thing. So it's definitely a great communication tool, and it helps contextualize kind of the work that we do. So yeah, I think also on the other side, it's not just with clients, but also with the approving bodies. It's quite helpful to get them to understand that we can move away from the idealized kind of code compliant hand calculations and demonstrate kind of safe designs with that kind of modeling case, and show that yes, the time isn't exactly what you might expect if you did it by hand, but we can kind of demonstrate that it's still an acceptable design, and we provide safety in our designs.
Michael, I'm interested in your views on that, because I know that you've worked across various different areas in maybe some designs which might be on the fence in terms of like a strict code compliance kind of way. And so sometimes it's about proving, and sometimes it's about telling the story to get people on side from like a performance-based design perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say I would echo what Sarah and Lucy have said. It's not just about analysis and doing tables of results and things. It's very much a communication tool, and perhaps it's important to highlight why it is like that. One of the things we often find in fire approvals process is there's an asymmetry of expertise, with often modelers having a lot more knowledge about human behavior models than the approvers, who have to do a whole host of approving other things. And what that means is they need more hand holding, and they need to trust us more to take them through the steps of what we've done, why we consider it appropriate. So I think that's why communication forms such an integral part of using a model.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because it's and it's a good way to phrase it as well, because it's not like it's an approving body's fault because they have a lot of things to do. So yeah, I think that's a really good thing. Shifting gears a little bit, and then we will get to the Q&A. So please do put your questions. If you are struggling with the actual Q&A function on Teams, feel free to drop it in the chat, and some of the Oasys folks will just move it across, migrate it across. So I guess just as kind of a final set of questions, because I know that sometimes people use these tools in ways that the development team doesn't necessarily intend initially. We try and build a flexible system, and then sometimes we're pleasantly surprised that people have modeled movement in strange areas or like interesting corners of the world or things like that. Or even just, it could be a really fairly straightforward project, but looking at a particularly interesting challenge. And I'd just like to get all of your thoughts on that. And so Sarah, let's start with you, just in terms of, I guess, like, is there anything that stands out from like an unconventional or a slightly non-standard use of the tool to try and get a client on side?
Yeah, sure. So I think MassMotion's been invaluable on all the projects I've worked on, but one stands out in particular, which is a very crowded underground station, about 60,000 people per hour. It was an old underground station with no existing plans of the station, so reality capture was used to be able to scan and then quickly build a model of that. So that was done within a couple of weeks from scanning to actually getting it into the model, and that was really constrained in terms of being an underground station and with no option to actually expand the footprint of the station. And MassMotion was used to look at different ways to maximize the space, looking at changing vertical transport, altering gate lines, one-way systems, just trying to get as much capacity as possible out of a very restricted space. And the MassMotion was really invaluable for that. We put forward a number of possible mitigation measures, which the client has taken forward some of those. So yeah, that was a challenging project, which was well received by the client.
It must be a good feeling to sometimes to do all the work and have someone say like, yes, we will actually implement these changes. They could be operational, they could be design refinements. So yeah. Lucy, what about you?
I mean, I guess given my limited experience, there's probably no like crazy unique projects that we've used it on, but I know that we are kind of, a lot of our work isn't kind of new builds and designs where we can kind of control where it goes, but we've got existing buildings which are kind of heritage buildings or ones that were kind of designed a while ago, and perhaps they're not going to meet today's current standards and stuff. So I think what Sarah was saying about the reality capture and actually building up a model based on existing designs, because I know we've struggled with kind of getting plans before for old buildings, and they can have changes in floor levels depending on which part of the building was erected when, and it's all a bit of a nightmare to model. So I think using reality capture and being able to model spaces which probably aren't going to meet today's guidance, but we can still kind of test to see if they can provide an acceptable level of safety. I think that's kind of quite a cool area that we can use MassMotion for.
And I think that's critically important when we look at the state of the world, and in terms of like trying to drive down the amount of concrete that we're putting into the world, new builds, things like that, and kind of moving towards more kind of sustainable reuse of spaces and things like that. I think that will become increasingly important. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, Michael, what do you think? Unconventional stuff, I guess.
I guess two projects stick out for me. One is using MassMotion on a research project to see how well we could model the evacuation of trains, high-speed trains and multi-level trains. Instead of going from the very big, it's quite a confined environment, and that creates some challenges with resolving conflicts between people and things like that. So that was a really interesting project that I've used MassMotion for. But conversely, I've used MassMotion and been involved in the team looking at MassMotion evacuation of super high-rise buildings, which are like 600 meters tall, and it needs to use the lifts for evacuation. And that presented various challenges in terms of evacuation, but also in terms of just developing the evacuation strategy for the building. And yeah, I would say those are two of my most novel projects, I guess.
Yeah, I think yeah, they're both super cool. And I remember some of the work around the high-speed trains. And I think that when we, just pivoting very briefly to talk about the sort of the research side of things, it was amazing to see some of that happen from a first principles perspective. You know, actually doing it on a live train and things like that is extremely cool. And I know that's something that the fire world is very, very good at. And I would love to see that industry and academia work more closely together on ingesting the results of those sorts of things. And so that's where I think we'd like to take the product, because it's very, very cool. So yeah, thanks all for your insights about the various different stages of looking at how we deploy these tools with clients and how we use them on various different projects around the world. I'd like to make sure that we're making good use of time and we're getting to as many questions as we can. And so, John, I might throw back to you for you to curate some of the questions for anyone on the panel. And if there's anything that is quite MassMotion specific, I'm happy to take those.
Okay, thank you very much, all. This is probably one of my favorite parts of these types of sessions. This is where all of our registrants and attendees can actually put you guys on the spot. So here we go. And let's just say there are some really good questions which have come through, and there's still time to get those questions into the Q&A right now, and we'll get as many as we can. If not, we will answer those in a response afterwards. First one really goes to you, Lachlan, and I guess this is a question that comes around quite a bit, and it is, are there any specific features or improvements we will see in future versions of MassMotion?
So I think the new engine will be it will be the biggest step change in how agents actually move in MassMotion for the last almost decade. I would say. For a time, we did some stuff around agent movement in the pandemic, which I know is a bit passé to talk about, but making some changes to look at physical changes, physical distancing and things like that. I would hope that we've already started to see the benefits in terms of performance improvements in currently released versions. I would hope that next year we are having some early preview work, not full release, but early preview work for things like looking at family groups in MassMotion, looking at different levels of physical ability in MassMotion and things like that. We are not just focusing on the behavioral side of things in the new engine. It will also be things like making sure that we can integrate very closely with cloud providers. And so we've had a number of different conversations with some of the major cloud providers in terms of if someone is running a major very, very large simulation with hundreds of thousands of people, you can do that on a fast desktop. But if you want to run hundreds of thousands of people or 1 million people, and you want to run 15 different scenarios, and say you're doing an evacuation and you need to run each one of them 20 times to make sure that you have some statistical significance, that starts to balloon a little bit. And so in some of our preliminary testing, we've looked at sort of order of magnitude plus speed increases. And we're very excited about that. We are going to have to wait a little bit longer for some of that because it's a very sort of root and branch overhaul. That's sort of the major medium to long-term thing. In terms of the slightly shorter term thing, which I can be a bit more concrete about, we are going to be releasing a new version either late this year or early next. And that's going to have a number of different things, further enhancements to automation, but also different ways to interrogate space. And so that's looking at new analytics for looking at things like what is the level of accessibility for various different aspects in the model, and looking at things like how much harder is it to access, say, the lowest platform in an underground station if you're in a wheelchair versus if you are able-bodied. And so looking at that, trying to look at the accessibility difference in a space, and really trying to look at things not just from a capacity perspective. And there'll be a number of other things that as we go on with the engine, when things fall out of it early, we'll fold that in to releases that come out, rather than holding it off for sort of like a year or two and doing a kind of big bang. So that's kind of what we're working towards. Hopefully that's good enough and not dodging the question.
Not at all. You never dodge a question, Lachlan. Well, no, you don't. We've got a kind of a follow-up to that one with regards to the sort of the agents that have disabilities, both physical and cognitive, particularly because there's no virtual, or there's virtually no relation to the movement of those. The new engine and the work that's underway right now will actually help contribute to that.
Yeah, so just on that specifically, we would find it fairly easy, and there's a number of different people in either the consulting space or the academic space who have like custom wheelchair avatars, and people who've got interesting movement scripts that have been written to do things like controlling rate of turning and speed and things like that. I made the call to not put something like that directly in the software right now, because when we think about things like physical disability, we need to be extremely confident that we're covering as much breadth as possible and not leaving certain sections of the population behind. And so it's really about, when we do it, we want to do it in an extremely comprehensive way, rather than just do it as a tick box exercise. But if anyone is interested in, I want to model a particular type of physical disability, particularly if that's based on something that is peer reviewed or publicly available data, I would be absolutely delighted to have that chat about how we could help with the software development kit. That's physical disability. Cognitive is a little bit different, and it's a very interesting and somewhat challenging space in sort of the research world. And we have a number of different partnerships with a couple of universities around the world looking into this. I can't actually promise how we bring that in, other than giving people the tools to be able to do this in a quite flexible sort of scripting way, because I'm not sure, honestly, at this point, exactly how we template that, various different levels of cognitive load and things like that, because it depends so extremely on various different factors. And that could be building type, it could be geographic location, it could be population makeup and demographics. That's not to say that we won't have a go, and we are having a go. And I think as we expanded the research capabilities within the product team, that will definitely help. But that's kind of where we're at on that one.
Thanks. I guess this next one's going to be open to the floor, so feel free to anyone to jump in. How do we validate a model? And in the case of the model's outcomes not in line with reality, how do you find which input parameters need adjustment?
I'm happy to take this one up.
Thanks, Michael.
Being as I'm on the ISO committee for evacuation model validation. So, I mean, it's a great question. So first thing I would highlight for anyone who's a user of any model, there is an ISO document which came out year before last, I think, to do with evacuation model validation verification. So if you're using any model, you should check perhaps whether it's actually been verified according to those tests, and which I know MassMotion is currently developing this test suite for. So that's kind of verification. In terms of validation, probably to take a step back, validation isn't something you do once and say, look, I've got a document, trust me. It's an ongoing process, and it's almost like an ethos or an attitude that a software company needs to adopt, where continually validation is done. Sort of bring on to that, what I would do is you have to do it relative to your specific application of the building type. So if you've done validation for a stadium and then you're doing a high-rise building, that's not the same thing, right? So that's a really important thing to consider, that it's relative to your specific building application. Now, what to do when it's not in line with reality? Well, because we're dealing with high levels of variability, it's very rare that your model will do exactly the opposite of what happened in reality. So often it's in between, there's lines of grey, and then you need to define thresholds of what's acceptable. I think just being aware of validation and checking the validation documentation is probably the quick win that every model user can do at the moment. In terms of when it's not in line with what you expect, for fire evacuation, it's actually really difficult because we don't have a feedback loop whereby there's a real evacuation and we can see if our model's right or wrong. Often we're designing for events which will never happen. However, saying that, in normal pedestrian circulation situations, there's opportunities once a built environment is built to learn what actually happens and then reflect on what you've done in the model. That feedback process. Now, admittedly, that creates something somewhat of an accountability situation, because if the model does produce, if what happened in real life doesn't happen in your model, then you're left in an awkward conversation with the client saying, well, hang about. And then you're left either saying, well, it's just a model, or you know, it's based on assumptions that we didn't assume were going to happen. So it creates some interesting situations, but for fire evacuation, it's a really difficult thing for us to, you know, to get that feedback in. So I've spoken some stuff. Hopefully that's something of use. And yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Like you said, some of these questions will put you on the spot. And good, thanks. That's a really good answer. Lucy, given your experience in modelling, I'm going to direct this next one to you. How can we integrate an agent-based pedestrian evacuation model with an architectural model in Revit simultaneously, or is it not even possible? I guess this one's referring to sort of the native model in Revit and bringing that data and that geometry into MassMotion.
Yeah, so I think as we currently stand, it is a case of extracting what we have in a Revit model, and that, I mean, a Revit model is a collection of 3D things put together by different disciplines, and we will take what we need from that model and we'll put it into MassMotion, because MassMotion is then the tool that lets us put agents in and see how we use the space in terms of a modeling context. So I don't think there is currently a way to kind of do that all in one space within Revit, but we can certainly improve the way in which we get those two tools to talk to each other and have kind of that automatic, like, taking out what we need from the Revit and putting it into MassMotion and using it quicker and quicker. That's probably all I can say. Lachlan, you can jump in if you want.
Yeah, so just quickly on that one, and Sarah and Michael, please feel free to add to any of this if you'd like. But from a product perspective, that is something that we would like to do a better job of, to be honest. And it's one of those things that it is about the industry kind of propelling itself forward in a holistic way, rather than just a single tool builder. And that's not to sort of remove responsibility. But if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, the answer is, I'm just not sure it's possible, because I'm not sure there are common data standards and things like that in the overall BIM world. Fast forward to now, it is slightly more possible, and we're working on a couple of things, but that's a more longer term thing. In 2 years' time, maybe we have a more amenable data environment to actually have BIM data flow through between different packages more and more readily. And we would love to be one of the early adopters of that. There are a couple of different industry standards that are looking and moving towards this. And hopefully that gains more and more traction over time. Things like Speckle would be one of those, and looking to try and make that as easy as possible to kind of pull down changes to BIM models. I think that's what everyone in the industry would want. So awesome. Yeah, we're up for it.
Thank you. Sarah, just to ensure that you're not getting off lightly, I'm going to direct the next one towards you. So how does MassMotion allow users to consider variability in crowd behavior and movement patterns?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. I might hand that one to Lachlan, actually.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think it's interesting because it's one of those from a variability perspective in terms of various different movement patterns. And I'm going to take my product lead hat off, and I'm going to jump back into the sort of the transportation world. That's usually something that practitioners will try and control for before they get to the modeling. I think sometimes, and Sarah, you might agree with that, in terms of we try and limit the number of scenarios that can be run, which is partly a function of these things take time, and we want to make sure that we limit our risk. But as tools get faster and faster, and as we bring in more different types of agent behavior, and also the ability for people to upload based on real data, ideally, things like capturing data on how people move and the relationship between speed and density and flow rate, bringing that in and tailoring your own models to the data that you have around how people move, I think that really gets to that question. And rather than saying to a client, and this is particularly in the sort of non-evacuation space where things are a little bit more, they need to be a little bit more prescribed because you're dealing with life safety issues. If we're looking at things like design, I think it would be lovely to be able to give users of these sorts of tools the ability to say, when a client says, what is this based on? Or how do we make sure that this is accounting for variability? To say, we went out with some cameras and we captured some crowd movement, and this model of your space is based on this data of your space, rather than this is based on these research papers and this industry standard and XYZ. Now, it doesn't really work if you don't have a space. So you have to default to something. But I think especially when we're looking in that retrofit world, building that handshake between real world data and simulation work, we are hoping to make easier and easier over time.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to rattle through these because I know we're cutting it fine on time, and there's still a few more questions to get through. This one's directed towards you again, Lachlan, and it's regards to accessibility to the SDK and to someone who's got minimal experience in coding and programming in general. Would it be extremely helpful if there were some, to expand this question, extremely helpful if there was some sort of support to help build scripts, perhaps resource and useful scripts could be built, both from the Oasys team as well as from external MassMotion users.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is a really interesting one because I would love this. And sometimes there is a bit of a reticence for people to share their own work because sometimes it has an element of risk, particularly when you're doing stuff that is not in the vanilla tool, so to speak. And so from the point of view of if I'm a user of the tool, which hopefully a number of people on the call are, if you can blame me for why the tool does what it does, and you don't have to take that risk on yourselves as fire engineers or transport planners or aviation analysts or architects or et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's always a place for that. I think that makes sense. But I do think some people would love to see various different scripts. And the main thing would be putting things out in a format, and I think we'd be happy to host this, but also a culture of, hey, I'm going to upload this. This is kind of cool. This isn't validated. And you're going to have to use it at your own risk. And I think we would just, so long as we're very, very clear about that, we'd be happy to seed that with a number of different sort of, I don't want to say tech demos, but things that aren't at the standard, our sort of quite exhaustive validation standards, which would let you look at various different environments. We have talked in the past about curating an environment for that, and I'm happy to give that another go.
Cool. Thanks, Lachlan. Sarah, should we try again? Absolutely no pressure. So can we, are we able to make active different movements to the agents, like children, disabled, or elderly?
Yes, so we can change the profile of the agents that we're modeling, so we can manually adjust those to different parameters. So there are default parameters within MassMotion that are set up, but we can adjust them to replicate different types of agents that within the model, including actually changing the way that they look, so we can model people within wheelchairs, even bikes, and adjust the parameters to replicate the movements of those type of people through the model.
Awesome, thanks, Sarah. Lachlan, this one's going over to you again. Are there any plans to add photorealistic skins to agents, like competitor software such as Pathfinder?
Good question. Really good question. And the short answer is not really. And that's for a couple of different reasons, is because we've actually, well, actually, it's not really. We've got someone in the team looking at the pipeline right now. But really what my focus is we are happy to always make things a little bit easier. So in the second most recent version, we made a few changes to the agent avatars. What I really want to do is to make sure, you can currently do this now, but to make it easier and easier over time, to export the way that the agents move, so that you can move that into, say, the Unreal Engine or Unity or whatever visualization package you're most comfortable with, because I think that lets you tweak photorealism and things like that in a way that adds value and doesn't add distraction. So we are working on making those pipelines easier. Will we have a button within MassMotion to give all of the agents hair, so to speak, or put them all in various different forms of clothing? Not in the short term is the short answer to that, and that's partly because the agents look like little jelly beans, because when you have 700,000 of them on screen at the same time, if they're all in little suits, it's very slow. And that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you only have a certain number of outfits, it becomes a distraction. That's actually one thing where generative AI, and I can't believe I'm throwing AI buzzwords into this chat, but will actually really come in handy. And there's a real potential for that to generate things like different avatars. And yeah, so we might work on it, but not in the short term is the honest answer to that.
Cool. Thank you very much. There's still a few more questions to go, but no, we are running very short on time. There's one quick one, I guess, which does come up from time to time. I know it's been discussed internally, and it's in regards to the appearance of smoke and the fact of it affecting agent speed, particularly within fire engineering. Is this something that is being investigated and being able to import data to simulate?
Yes, I'll take this one. And so very conscious of time and want to be able to kind of wrap up. But so this will probably be the last question, if that's okay with everyone. Yes, being actively worked on. And once we have a system that is academically defensible, building that workflow is something that I would love to put in the core software itself. And so currently it can be done using the software development kit, but that's also why the SDK is extremely useful, to be able to take things, test them, prove that they're possible, prove that they're performant, then make changes and integrate that into the core software. So that's where we're at in terms of smoke integration. And so it's changing agent speed, it's doing things like fractional effective dosage, and also changing overall destination based on visibility. So that's something that we're actively looking at more from a research perspective. So yeah, but just conscious of time, I just want to, and John, hopefully it's okay if I do this, but just to say thank you once again to all of the people who joined and to anyone who's viewing the recording. But a massive thank you, John, to yourself. But I would argue more importantly to Lucy, Sarah, and Michael for taking time out of your day and for your insight into how these tools get used in the industry. So thanks again, very, very much. And if anyone has any questions, I think you know where to go.
Just one quick thing to add before we do wrap up. I know there's a couple of questions that we haven't got around to answer. What I'll do is I'll reach out to the panel and get an answer, and actually and get back to those questions in due course. And thank you very much all.
Awesome. Hope everyone has a really lovely rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.